This book is thus not about war, but about men, the average common German soldiers of World War II. War itself forms the background and environment, but as in all great tragedy, the theme is human destiny and suffering, as experienced by a group of individuals, a group bound together in a common effort to endure the unendurable. It is about fear and courage, camaraderie and individual pain, the feelings of men under extreme stress, and the unique sensations that war produces. It is about the patient creation and recreation of relationships after one catastrophe and their destruction by another. One doesn't have to empathize with these men in order to depict accurately what they experienced. There was the war, Guy Sager recalled, and I married it because there was nothing else when I reached the age of falling in love. Historians so hunger after the analytical and explanatory that they lose contact with the mysteries and dynamics of individuals and groups which constitute history, thus the authentic personal side of history, the insight into the human soul, spirit, and behavior, is sacrificed for the sake of some nebulous conjecture, some equally repugnant effort to mold the historical record to fit one or another special ideological doctrine. Unless you're a shitlib, that is. In either case, the personal is renounced for the impersonal, and in the case of war, the actual killing and bloodletting done and suffered by human beings gives way to the sanitized intellectual exercise of evaluating strategy and tactics, or perhaps logistics. Since the average soldier is too often consumed by the great events of history, the approach of everyday history seeks a sensitivity to the human tragedies entwined in these impersonal cataclysms, yet one that is perceptive and accurate without being soft-hearted. In studying the harsh and terrible circumstances faced by the anonymous soldier, one can learn not only something of the effect of war on the individual spirit, but also something of life. The cruelty, horror, and fear that hollow men on the inside, as well as the compassion, courage, spirit of comradeship, and the steady endurance with which the spareness of life is overcome. Not the least of the paradoxes of war is the fact that though war brings out the worst in us, it also elicits our best qualities. Too many people learn about war with no inconvenience to themselves, Guy Sager complained. They read about Verdun or Stalingrad without comprehension. Sitting in a comfortable armchair with their feet beside the fire, preparing to go about their business the next day, as usual. One should really read such accounts under compulsion, in distress or discomfort, in grief, from a hole in the mud. One should read about war in the worst circumstances, when everything is going badly. One should read about war standing up, late at night, with lead in your feet, when one is tired. The substance of my task, Sager maintained in writing his memoirs, was to reanimate, with all the intensity I could summon, those distant cries from the slaughterhouse. War is vile, but the chronicle of the Lanzer shows that not all who fight wars are vile. The very length of German involvement in World War II, almost 6 years, led many Lansers to adapt to a war environment. The average soldier could not simply step out of his human existence, but instead lived in a world that became routine and true to him. In addition, as their letters and diaries illustrate, many of these men were not reduced to a state of unreflective consciousness, but were highly articulate, literate, and sought to understand the essence of the everyday life of war. The everyday life of war does not remain in any isolated world that can be studied in a laboratory fashion. Rather, war itself is a catalyst for significant social change, So there exists a complex and dynamic relationship between the life of men at war and the more general everyday life of those in civilian society. Everyday life in war, of course, does have its distinctive qualities, from bearing the burden of the permanent expectation of maiming or death, to the continual assimilation of suffering and destruction. It represents a life with neither security nor rest, neither emotional peace nor stable relations, where uncertainty is the most notable daily characteristic. For the Lanzer, each battle touched off complex emotions and often savage desires. In war, then, there is an inescapable underlying intensity that does not exist in peacetime life. There are no bourgeois inhibitions in war. In order to build a picture of the soldier's everyday life, historians increasingly use letters, diaries, and memoirs, primary sources, and the most reliable human documents available, to discover the common experiences of men at war. Each one who participated fought his own war, but out of the myriad individual perceptions emerged common themes and patterns. Problems, of course, surround this approach. The typical Lanzer, for example, rarely had the luxury of a writing table, or the time and the solitude, or, least of all, peace, in which to record all of his thoughts and insights concerning the nature of war. In any case, the great bulk of enlisted men were typically unversed in expressing themselves purely analytically, so that many first-hand accounts remain sunk in the banalities of humdrum everyday existence, or else speak of intimate matters of personal separation rather of the character and texture of life at the front. One factor that set the Lanzer apart from the average GI, or Tommy, or Ivan, however, was his generally greater descriptive power and higher degree of literacy. Contrary to popular belief, the average German soldier was not a plodding automaton. Reading through their letters and diaries, one is struck by their remarkable level of intelligence and lucidity. In part, this was a consequence of rigorous German educational systems, but it also owed much to the manner in which the Wehrmacht utilized its personnel. Unlike the American Army, which until 1944 shunted its most educated men into specialized roles, the Wehrmacht deployed a remarkably high percentage of its manpower as combat troops. As a result, even college-educated men found themselves in the foremost ranks. In addition, National Socialist doctrine emphasized the notion of Volksgemeinschaft, roughly modeled on the legendary trench socialism of World War I. Yeah, legendary because it was real. A national community whose social harmony, unity, and political authority rested on the integration of people from all walks of life, thus transcending all class conflict. Since the German army had a high proportion of educated men in the forward lines, men who had the inclination and ability to reflect on their experiences and commit them to paper. The result is a remarkably rich record of life at the front as chronicled in letters, diaries, and memoirs. The reality of censorship meant that many Lancers constantly felt the necessity of taking the scissors to their thoughts, not to avoid transmitting military information, such as troop strengths, dispositions, activities, but to keep political statements and attitudes circumspect. The censor obviously might not see everything that is written, but believe me, confirmed one Lanzer, a lot of crap is still written home. Still, the flood of letters to and from the front, estimated at about 40 to 50 billion total, and in some individual months as many as 500 million, meant that many passed through censorship unopened, and the longer the war continued, the less seriously many Lancers regarded the censors. As two of the leading authorities on German Feldpostbriefe, letters from the field, concluded after studying thousands of such missives, The mass of soldiers expressed their opinion and views in a surprisingly open and uninhibited fashion. Illustrating the actualities of combat from a personal point of view, the historian can better demonstrate the impact of war in all its dimensions. Such an approach also brings a vivid sense of immediacy and reality to the often impersonal topic of war. Furthermore, it affords insights into the mysteries of individual actions and group dynamics. In emphasizing this individual dimension, however, the historian needs to avoid engaging in trite idealization of the common man, and instead seek to provide an honest and accurate portrayal of everyday life at the front. They provide valuable insight into what remains one of the most puzzling ironies of the war. Why the average Lancer fought so furiously in defense of a seemingly deplorable regime. Nobody forced the soldiers to make positive comments about National Socialism. An army and the men in it cannot be completely separated from the value system which produced it. Indeed, an army tends to reflect the society from which it springs, so that if the men of the Wehrmacht fought steadfastly in support of Adolf Hitler and National Socialism, something within the Hitler state must have struck a responsive chord. This has been a short reading from Frontsoldaten, the American German soldier, the German soldier in World War II, by Stephen G. Fritz. University of Kentucky Press. Check it out.